You're listening to The Stall and Stable Show, ideas for happy horsekeeping.
We have a special treat this week. Actually, two treats. The first is Stacy Anderson from Triple Crown Nutrition for our Triple Crown Nutrition Spotlight, where we answer listener questions. The questions submitted for this week's episode include intestinal parasites and how they impact the ability of a horse's digestive system to absorb nutrients. Why is it important to limit spring grazing, especially after a morning frost? And we have a listener who's got a lovely little Jack Russell Terrier who likes to vacuum up spilled grain from the feed room floor. Is that a problem or not? And in the second half of the show, we have an excerpt from one of my favorite horse books of all time, Horse Brain, Human Brain, The Neuroscience of Horsemanship. This book will change the way you look at horses. It's an absolute must for every horse professional's library, whether you get it in print or audio format. This is a powerhouse episode, so listen in. This is episode 139 of the Stall and Stable Show, brought to you by American Stalls. Today's Wednesday, March 27th, 2024, and I'm your host, Helena Harris. Please support our sponsors as they help make this show possible. In addition to American Stalls, we're grateful for the support of Triple Crown Nutrition. And now it's time for my monthly segment with Triple Crown Nutrition Specialist, Stacy Anderson. Hi, Stacy, and welcome back to Stall and Stable.
Thanks for having me back again. I'm pleased to be here.
I think we're getting a handle on the groove of this segment, the Triple Crown Nutrition Spotlight. I'm starting to feel more comfortable. How about you?
Oh, definitely so. But, this is what I do all day, every day. So it's just making sure my microphone is working instead of having a good phone connection is really the biggest difference.
It's funny. I've been doing this a long time, and the people who come on are often experts, right? And they really know their material and have pre-interview or conversations, and they're so relaxed, and the conversations are great. And then as soon as you hit the record button, it's like da da da. And I'm the same way. I make a much better host than I do guest. But it's funny how our psychology decides that we want to just forget everything we know as soon as the record button goes on. You don't have that problem, so it's a joy to have you back on the show.
Thank you.
All right. So listeners, we had a question from our last segment that we didn't get to. So we're going to start with that today. And then we had two questions from listeners. Thank you for everyone who wrote in with your questions. I am stockpiling them, and Stacy and I will get to them in future segments. So today, the three questions we're going to go over are relate to, one is intestinal parasites and how they impact the ability of a horse's digestive system to absorb necessary nutrients. The other is about spring grazing after a morning frost, which is starting to become an issue this time of year. And then lastly, we had a question about a little Jack Russell named Biscuit, who likes to eat ration balancer that falls to the ground. So we're going to cover each one of these questions. Let's start, Stacy, with how intestinal parasites can affect our horse's digestive system and their ability to get all the right nutrients out of what we're feeding them.
Yeah, absolutely. So most horses are going to have at least a little bit of some sort of parasite load, right? It's kind of impossible to have a horse that has none at all, but can happen. So the goal is to try to keep your parasite loads at levels that are not impacting your horse's health and performance. At Triple Crown, we are kind of follow the new research, which says it's actually better to have fecal tests done to look for specific parasites and egg counts, and then treat based upon that versus just having a random treatment protocol that you're running through a couple times a year. And the reason for that is obviously you could have parasites that are becoming resistant to the anti-parasite medications that you're using. And if you have a horse that has a low parasite load that's not being affected, by doing a treatment, you actually are also kind of damaging their microbiome, right? Because you're attempting to kill parasites, you're also impacting other good beneficial bacteria in the horse's gut. So we really recommend a couple times a year taking a fecal sample into your vet, having it checked out, see what you need to test for. So internal parasites can really, usually you don't see a whole lot of issues unless your horse is having like a really large load, where you'll see things like, they can't hold weight, they have poor hair coat, they just kind of, look down, and so if you have these really overwhelming parasite loads, they can cause lesions in the digestive tract, intestinal lining issues, which really can impact the way your horse is absorbing their nutrients. And disgustingly enough, like sometimes when these worms are in there, there can be so many of them that they can cause impactions and colics and things like that. So, having a parasite treatment protocol, incorporating, fecal testing so that you know what you're trying to kill off in there, is really important.
Mayor Clarabelle, when she came to me from the rescue group, she showed signs of ulcers and gastro upset. What I was not prepared for was the bot infestation that she had in her stomach, which my veterinarian at the time said that was one of the largest bot nests, essentially, she had ever seen.
My goodness.
So unchecked parasites can go very, very wrong.
Definitely, definitely. And that's a really good point too. If you are bringing home a new horse, obviously you want to quarantine that horse in terms of preventing them from giving illness to your other horses. But also you may want to quarantine the locations that you have that horse, because if that horse is a shedder, you could be infecting pastures, which can then, get your entire herd in trouble. So that's really important too. Yeah. So make sure you're keeping those horses quarantined in an area that can be cleaned up afterwards, and get them fecal tested as soon as possible so you can start addressing if there's any issues so you don't spread it to the rest. There's all kinds of ways too, in addition to treating for parasites, all types of different things you can do to try to help prevent. Obviously, it depends upon whether you have the horse at your home and you have that sort of control, or if you're in a boarding situation, but being clean, right? So cleaning out watering sources to make sure that there's no fecal contamination there, making sure to clean up after your horse, both in the stall and in the stable, so that we don't have manure sitting around for long periods of time where, these things are hatching out, that type of thing. So yeah, anything that you can do outside of doing treatments, which also can be disruptive to your horse's digestive system, to minimize parasite load is important as well. So management techniques, you can work with your local extension office to help you with those specifically for your area.
But let's not wait for our horse's body condition to give us a sign that they might have parasites. Regular fecal testing is really the best way to do that, right?
Exactly. Yes. I recommend it at least twice a year. For some folks, it's, 4 times a year is great, just to do fecal testing and see where you're at. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Especially when you're moving horses, either horses coming in or horses going out where they could cross-contaminate. It maybe, and it's such a cheap and easy test to do. It's like, why not?
Exactly.
It can give you at least peace of mind, if not tell you what's in your horse's gut and help you better target those parasites too.
Absolutely. When we're deworming, we're wiping out a lot of good bacteria and things in the horse's digestive system. So if it doesn't need to be done, I wouldn't do it. But yeah, so that's kind of where that is. What's more at risk for your horse? Deworming them and having that chemical take out some good bacteria, or having a light load of parasites that it really isn't impacting your horse at all.
That's great. I love that it's like a risk analysis. And, when my daughter was a baby and I was trying to decide what vaccines to give her and when, her pediatrician kept saying, every vaccine is a risk reward analysis situation. You have to decide if you think the risk of the bad things happening is much greater than perhaps vaccine side effects. Let's go with the vaccine. So I think that's a good principle in general.
Great analysis. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Our next question. Why is it important to limit spring grazing after a morning frost? The grass is starting to come up all over these days, but yet temperatures are still dipping down low enough sometimes where morning frost and green grass are companions.
So when grass experiences frost, the rate of the grass utilizing the sugar that it's been producing during photosynthesis, it slows down the use of that sugar. And so you have a lot of sugars setting in that grass. And actually, this sugar can sort of be locked in for even upwards of a week, depending on the temperatures and, that type of thing. So, especially for horses that have metabolic concerns, digestive concerns, issues with colic and things like that, we don't want that high level of carbohydrates entering their bloodstream. So it's really important to limit your spring grazing, and even not just after a morning frost, but in general. Horses need to be transitioned pretty slowly to any new feed or forage source, because your horse, a lot of their health is based upon the microbes in their digestive system. And when we change what we're feeding them, we change their microbes. And those horses need time to kind of adapt and adjust so that they don't get things like colic and diarrhea and things like that. So we generally recommend making sure that as spring is coming, you're slowly allowing your horses time on pasture, generally starting with 15 to 30 minutes a day. And then every couple of days, kind of slowly increasing by 15 or 30 minutes. Also, keeping in mind that if you do suddenly have a random frost in there, that you might have to back off for a little bit until that is overcome. Grazing muzzles are a great option to help slow down horses. It's been estimated it can reduce their intake by anywhere between like 30 and 80%, depending on the horse and the grazing muzzle. So that can be really helpful to prevent that. But anytime we're changing horses' main dietary sources, we want to kind of do that slowly and introduce it gradually so they don't founder colic.
And this is a question that comes up for me often. If my horses are out on crappy pasture, let's just say all winter long, they're out there just for moving because that's where they live and to get hay. But as the grass starts to come up, it's not really edible yet. It's not tall enough to be a significant addition to their diet. But then it does. Then one day the sun comes out, the rain comes out, and then it does. Does the fact that they've been on it as this grass is growing change? Does that kind of take the place of the gradual exposure to the sugars? Or do we say, even though my horses have been out on this pasture as it's coming in, I still need to take them off it and manage their exposure to it?
Great question. So, as I say a lot of times, it depends. so in general, it is best to have, like, during the winter, you want your horses moving around, that type of thing. If it is possible, you should have them on essentially what you call like a sacrifice lot, right, during that time, because horses are really hard on pasture. So this gives your good pastures a chance to actually grow appropriately, right? Many areas of the country, spring is a time of a lot of mud. So in the springtime, we go from muddy situations to frosty situations, that type of thing. And with having horses out on that pasture, you can really harm the effect of having good pasture starting. So generally we recommend, if you can, if in your situation you can, try to have a sacrifice area for the winter for their movement. So in that case, then yes, you would want to introduce them slowly. If you can't do that, which a lot of people don't have enough space that their horses are always out on pasture, if you have a horse that is their metabolic concerns, the horses that have foundered in the past, insulin resistance, Cushing's that's not being managed super well, even for those horses, you may need to be really careful as that spring grass is sprouting up, even though they've been on it all through the winter. Why? Because stressed grass and growing grass at certain times of the day are high sugar.
I'm glad that you say stressed grass, because stressed can mean several things. It's not just being trampled by horses or being overgrazed. It's the weather can stress it as well. So frost would be considered one of those environmental stresses. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
My older horse, Brody, who I've said this before, is typey for metabolic issues, even though he's not, thank goodness. But we want to keep it that way. And so my vet had recommended that Brody be turned out in a sacrifice paddock during the day, and then he can graze at night when it's safer, when the sugars are lower. And so what I try to recommend to folks when they are planning their horses' turnout areas, even if it is small, if there's grass in any place, if you can separate it so that at least there's a place for your horse to go when those sugars are the highest, then that's a good plan. And so, and if you can't, you can't. We get that. There are other things we can do to mitigate the risk.
Absolutely. So
Okay.
grazing muzzles. And as you mentioned, generally after dark, so about 2 to 4 hours after the sun sets and it's been dark and the grass has a time to kind of calm down after the day, it's safe, safe for most horses, even horses with mild metabolic symptoms, to be out on some pasture after that time. And then we generally want to have them brought back in before the dew is dry in the morning. That is
Okay.
generally the safest time to have horses out on pasture.
Okay.
Mhm. Yep.
Good. And listeners, if you have a question at all about that, talk to your veterinarian because your vet will know what your specific region of the US is, what the weather is, what the growing pattern is, and they'll be able to give you more specific guidelines about what's best, what's safest for your horse.
Absolutely. There's a website that I use frequently. It's called, I think it's safergrass.org. That's been pretty helpful as well. It's got some great information there.
Okay, I put that in the show notes so we can put that, we'll put that link up for you guys. All right, next question. We are cruising. Oh my God, we're actually organized.
I
Okay.
didn't get off topic today.
And if you did, Stacy, I wouldn't tell you because this is too much fun. All right. This one came in from a longtime listener. Hi, Helena. I have a question that I've been dying to know the answer to. My little Jack Russell Biscuit loves to clean up my draft cross, Butters. Yes, Butters and Biscuit. Butters' ration balancer grain. My dog is about 20 pounds and probably eats between 1/2 to 1 teaspoon of grain a day. Do I have to worry about any sort of toxicity, like too much copper or something like that? I hate to stop it because she just loves to do it and goes crazy for grain. I'd love to know Triple Crown's nutrition on this. Thanks so much. Okay,
Yep.
that's from Elizabeth. Here we go.
Oh, Elizabeth, I feel your pain. I have puppies too, and I understand completely. So I have to say though, so Triple Crown, we only do premium products and we only do horses, right? So we only focus on horses. We don't do feeds for other species. And so our ration balancer is a highly fortified vitamin and mineral supplement for horses. It is so highly fortified that it is intended to be fed to 1,000-pound horse at 1 or 2 pounds a day. That's for 1,000-pound animal. And your little biscuit is nowhere near 1,000 pounds. So while you may not see any ill effects from biscuit eating up a couple of pellets, it is not recommended. Only because it's a product that is fortified for a larger animal, a much
So it's
larger
highly
animal.
concentrated.
Yes,
So there's a
so
lot
highly
of power
concentrated.
in that tablespoon. Yeah.
Exactly. And we don't know what other, we don't know what dog food you're feeding. We don't know what other treats or supplements you might be feeding your dog. So we wouldn't recommend it. So I would recommend getting a fancy treat that he likes that's only for at the barn and have him do that instead of eating the Triple Crown Balancer or horse feed products just for optimal safety because we all know how much we love our little guys.
Yes, yes. That's a really interesting question, though, because there's a difference between feed and the ration balancer. I mean, some feeds or many feeds are fortified, but not to the level that a balancer is going to be. Cats, dogs, birds, everybody else wants to dip into the grain bin because it's so delicious. So this is good advice. For me, I have to be careful that I don't spill my grain because I go through my feed room like I'm off to a holy war, and
Yeah.
but it's a good practice to be tidy when you're feeding for any number of reasons. We don't want to invite rodents and bugs and drop some grain on the floor for our dogs. So thank you, Elizabeth, for sending in this question. I wish we had a different answer for you, but that's the best one.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's it for this week's segment. Listeners, you can go up to stallandstable.com and I will have links to more information. So if you want to follow up, as well as how you can get in touch with Stacy and the team at Triple Crown if you have further questions. Stacy, once again, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a wonderful week.
Oh, thank you so much. Glad to be back again and speak with you all soon.
If you're building a barn, rebuilding a barn, renovating, or just looking to upgrade what you have already, check out AmericanStalls.com. American Stalls has the best quality, hands down, of any stall component or accessory for your barn. Whether you have a center aisle, a shed row, run-in stalls, or something else, go to American Stalls first. We are building a modest barn here at Who To, and guess whose catalog I'm thumbing through this week? You got it. American Stalls. I suggest you do the same. You can find their full catalog and support and resources at americanstalls.com. As longtime listeners may know, I've partnered up from time to time with Trafalgar Square Books, the publisher behind Horse and Rider books. And, as some of you may also know, I was honored to record the audio version of Horse Brain, Human Brain. Horse Brain, Human Brain, written by Janet Jones, Ph.D., is about the neuroscience of horsemanship, that special partnership between the human and the horse, in particular, their brains, how they work together, how they're similar, and how they're different. I chose a chapter at random to share with you today to get you inspired. And if you haven't read the book or listened to the book, I think it's important to give you an idea of what you'll find behind the cover. Horse Brain, Human Brain, The Neuroscience of Horsemanship by Janet Jones, Ph.D. Chapter 7. Patch ran the Kentucky Derby without a left eye, starting from a post position where all his competitors were invisible. Gunner cleaned up the World Championship reigning titles from 1996 to 2002, fully deaf. Addie is blind in his right eye, but that didn't stop him from winning the Hickstead Derby, famous for its tricky high-speed course over obstacles that stand 5 feet high. There's no doubt that horses with sensory disabilities can compete with the best. But how do their brains manage these feats? And how do those same brain processes affect horse and human teams with no disabilities? Chickpea is dead to the leg from years of spurs resting against her sides. Strong contact with unforgiving hands has hardened her mouth. She makes no move on her own, waiting for her rider to command her pace and placement from moment to moment. Her sister Mac is just the opposite. She's highly sensitive to every aid and carries her own body without a helicopter parent up top. What is happening inside their brains to cause this disparity? And how can we ride with their brains to address it? Take Corey for a ride, and he'll show you whether the barn hose was wound to the left or to the right last night. Horses notice tiny alterations, and most will tell you about them if you're listening. One reason for this is that horses don't group similar items together the way we do. The tractor that grooms the arena might be fine, but the same tractor coming down a barn aisle is a fire-breathing dragon from Dante's seventh circle of hell. Why? And what does this mental process mean for horses' performance and welfare? Each of these 3 situations rest on brain-level processes that fuse perception from all senses, including the horse's superpower of touch. 1. Sensory compensation. The ways the brain overcomes the loss of one sense by beefing up its use of another. 2. Neural fatigue. The ways neurons adapt to stimulation and require dynamic change rather than static constancy to drive their action. And 3. Categorical perception. The tendency to perceive varied items as a group so that the brain can treat them as a whole. Sensory compensation. Horses with sensory disabilities, like blindness or deafness, usually perform well, especially if they have learned their disciplines prior to losing the use of an eye or an ear. Eye ulcers require an affected eye to be removed after gradual deterioration of sight. That's what happened to Addie and Patch. Because many horses continue their work with partial blindness, we tend to guess it's not a big deal. But cover up your left eye, then run as fast as you can on an angle to the left, amidst 20 of the fastest galloping stallions in the world. It's not as easy as it looks. Deafness is rare in horses, with the exception of those who have bald white faces extended way up the forehead. That lack of pigmentation can cause a congenital form of splashed white deafness because it alters receptor cells in the horse's inner ear. In both horses and humans, these cells transform sounds into neural impulses. Horses born deaf require visual cues during groundwork, but use typical body aids under saddle. They startle more easily at unexpected sights and smells, or at sudden touches. We might guess they are calm as can be when the paint sprayer is blown out with an air gun. But in fact, deaf horses pay close attention to nearby animals and will spook from their friends' or handlers' responses to noise. In general, deaf horses do very well. Just ask Tough Sunday, who's earned $362,000 so far as a hearing-impaired racehorse in California. Horses who become blind or deaf during their lives, for example when an infection damages the organ gradually, have few problems adapting. Their brains have developed with normal sensory input. In other words, neural networks have already formed by virtue of learning and experience. Once the brain has at least partly developed, it adapts very well, even when big chunks are surgically removed. Human babies can lose as much as half a brain, an entire cerebral hemisphere, and still grow up to read, write, speak, love, play, work, and live just like the rest of us do. We'd never know there's nothing but cerebrospinal fluid sloshing around inside half the skull. In humans and horses, when one sense is deprived of information, the brain pays more attention to input from the other senses. So a deaf horse pays more attention to sights, and a blind horse pays more attention to sounds. The same compensation accounts for blind riders like Karen Law, who listens for directional cues while jumping mid-level cross-country and stadium courses, or Kristen Naus, who navigates flat classes by hearing hoofbeats echo off the rail. The sense organs have not changed, but the brain is now zeroing in on stimulation we usually ignore. Neurons in the auditory cortex strengthen in response to blindness, so that poorer vision creates better hearing. Training indoors. Views to the outside are diminished in any indoor arena, but some are fully enclosed with no windows, creating an environment in which horses cannot see out at all. Poor lighting adds general dimness, which, as we have seen, the horse cannot overcome for 45 minutes or so. Under these conditions, we would expect hearing, smell, and touch to become sharper, and indeed they do. Corey is an 18-year-old off-track thoroughbred, dark bay with especially delicate legs for his 17 one-hand height. His spookiness piggybacks on the many advantages of his supersensitivity. He's what I call a fiber ride. All of your aids are delivered with precisely timed alterations of only a few muscle fibers. Override this horse, and you're off to the races or face down in the dirt. Lighten up, and you're floating on perfection. One winter day, Corey and I were warming up alone in an ice-cold indoor arena. It was silent, his ears were speared forward like lasers, and every muscle was taut. You know, the pre-missile demeanor. Suddenly, a gunshot went off outside the long wall. Corey whirled and bolted. Fortunately, at the same time and in the same direction I did, so we stuck together. Determined not to reward the whirl with a halt, I put the horse into a strong trot. When we finished our session and my heart began to beat again, I went outside to see what had happened. Two barn friends had set chairs against the metal wall of the arena to enjoy a sunny sky in 3 feet of snow. The gunshot that scared Corey and me was the back of a lawn chair placed against that wall. The sound would have been barely noticeable outside, but riding indoors, your horse's brain, and your own, is paying much greater attention to sounds, smells, and touches because vision is limited. The effects of sensory deprivation are cumulative. When horses can't see out of an indoor arena, they rely more on hearing. If they're close to age 20, chances are good that their hearing is impaired. The combination of visual limitation and hearing impairment forces the equine brain to attend even more astutely to smell, and so on. When you work with horses in varied environments, consider which senses contribute most to their understanding. This way, you can anticipate what sort of behavior the horse will offer. And anticipation is a pillar of horse training. We have to know how and why a horse is likely to react before we can prevent that reaction. And preventing it in the first place is much more effective than training it away after it happens. Seeking cause. A related aspect of sensory compensation is the brain's desire to find cause. Young mammals develop partly by learning that actions have consequences. Push on a lever, and water comes out. Whinny, and a buddy looks over. Fiddle with a loose hatch, and the gate opens up. Non-actions have consequences too. Miss a flattened ear, and the alpha mare bites. With practice, the brain discovers that cause and effect is part of normal life. So it seeks the agent of cause and relies on it to predict upcoming events. Indoor arenas hide the cause of many unusual noises, reducing predictability. Outside, an approaching storm can be predicted. We feel the wind picking up, see the clouds moving in. But inside, all we know is that the walls suddenly moan in a high wind, the metal roof is deafening in hard rain, the big track doors open from outside with no warning. The arena ticks when wood supports expand and contract with invisible temperature change. Snow loads slide off the roof, ice dams drop to the ground outside, spring melt pours through gutters, thunder echoes inside four walls. And have you ever been schooling a hot horse indoors when lightning strikes the roof? I don't recommend it. Radio stations mask some scary noises in an indoor arena. Novice horses often look for the origin of radio voices, becoming calmer when they identify the source. When horses see someone walk to the radio and adjust its volume, they are less frightened than when an equivalent volume change has no apparent agent. These observations refute the notion common among many scientists that animals like horses do not seek the agents of cause. So, your horse might be more distressed than you know. Go easy on him during sensory deprivation. Build up time in the indoor arena gradually. Ask staff to minimize unpredictable outdoor noises, encourage relaxation, and praise calmness. Introduce scary places with a sniffing expedition on halter and lead, making the adventure as pleasant as possible. Add an experienced equine buddy if necessary. Consider sensory compensation when you're training outdoors as well. Wind excites the horse's powerful motion detector cells, creating unusual sights. Some of them are not even visible to you. At the same time, the noise of wind reduces information from hearing, and its sweep carries sense away. With a triple whammy like this, your horse will appreciate some reassurance. Sidebar. But my horse isn't nervous. People often remark that their horses aren't nervous. It's certainly true that there are individual differences. Breed, experience, training, age, and temperament all play a role. But research on trailering and clipping shows that many horses worry about these activities even though their nerves don't show. They experience increases in heart rate, blood pressure, eye temperature, and cortisol levels. The intervals of their heartbeats vary more from one moment to the next. And all of these internal signs of nervousness occur while the horses display calm, outward demeanors. End sidebar. Riding blind. Riders can use brain-based compensation to advance their skills. Back in the day, we used to train bareback and blindfolded. We jumped through chutes or on lunge lines, learning to feel the horse leave the ground. That way, when riding sighted, we wouldn't jump ahead or get left behind. I don't endorse blindfolds. When something goes wrong, you can't rip those babies off fast enough. But riders who are ready for this exercise can gently close their eyes while riding, opening them at any time. Start on a lunge line with a qualified trainer or at a walk on the long side of a familiar arena. As soon as your eyes are closed, you'll begin to feel much more of your horse's movement. Try to sense each foot as he sets it down. Feel his shoulders and hips moving back and forth. Identify which leg is doing what. Your horse's back will suddenly feel wider, so locate the central place of greatest balance. By forcing your brain to pay attention to information it normally ignores, this exercise builds skill, balance, strength, and confidence by the bushel. Of course, you can't go hog wild with it. Talk with a trainer who has observed your sighted skills first. Choose a calm, experienced school horse. Use a quiet paddock or round pen, and start with a few slow steps. And for goodness sakes, wear a helmet. Always wear a helmet when you ride. They're available in English and Western styles for $50 and can save you from a lifetime of mental impairment. Neural fatigue. The second brain level process we'll take on here is neural fatigue. Imagine you're a receptor cell, a rod or cone in the human eye. It's a stretch, I know, but work with me. There you are, faced with a beautiful pony. Millions of receptor cell buddies are standing near you, each responsible for one teensy pixel of the view. Your portion is an infinitesimal gleam of shine on the pony's shoulder. Together, all of you send your neural impulses to the visual cortex of the brain. The brain interprets them and says, "Aha! Look at that gorgeous, shining pony." Great fun. Okay, but here's the thing. You can't send that glimmer of shine to the brain forever. At some point, you're going to get tired standing rooted to the spot saying, "Glimmer of shine, glimmer of shine." Receptor cells fatigue fast. In fact, human visual receptor cells can transmit a signal for only a few seconds. Normally, our eyes make tiny involuntary movements all the time, like automatic tremors, so that each receptor cell gets a different view from one fraction of a second to the next. This prevents them from tiring. When an image is held still artificially, it disappears. This occurs because the cells cannot continue firing their impulses to the brain. Sidebar: illusions of movement. You can experience neural fatigue for yourself by staring at movement. Stand by a rushing river or a waterfall, even a heavy rain washing downhill, and watch the water move in one direction. Stare at the motion for a couple of minutes, then turn your eyes to a stationary sight. You'll notice that the water seems to have stilled, while the banks of the river or the sides of the waterfall appear to be moving in the opposite direction. What happened? The motion detector cells in your eyes became fatigued after sending downward, downward, downward signals to the brain. When they stopped due to exhaustion, nearby opponent cells sent the brain a flurry of upward, upward, upward signals, and your brain briefly interpreted that as the motion of a stationary object. It's an illusion of movement that horses can experience too. They just can't tell us in speech, "Hey, that ground is moving." And sidebar. I've used the example of vision for neural fatigue because it's easy for us to understand. But all sensory neurons, visual, auditory, olfactory, gustatory, tactile, get tired and stop responding until they have recovered. The brain adapts to static cues. That's why we stop feeling rings on our fingers or hearing fans a few seconds after they're on. Instead, the brain picks up change. Change, after all, is most important to survival. If a horse is grazing in a field, he doesn't need to know that a blade of grass is still. He needs to know when it moves. Many trainers, unaware of neural fatigue, advocate constant aids. Examples crop up in all riding disciplines. Dressage trainers often teach riders to hold steady on the outside rein at all times, as a support to the horse. Racing trainers encourage jockeys to apply constant pressure with both hands to help horse and rider balance on the bit as they run. Hunter-jumper trainers frequently ask that riders maintain strong lower leg pressure to keep the horse forward and the rider secure. Many Western pleasure trainers teach drape reins, even at the slowest possible jog, so that the horse receives a steady lack of contact on his mouth. Some eventing trainers advocate that the rider should match with their hands the weight of pressure produced by the horse's mouth. For example, if your horse gives you 5 pounds of mouth pressure, you respond with 5 pounds of hand pressure, and keep it constant. All of these are static cues. They are applied, maintained, and unchanged. They defy the reality of neural fatigue. causing us to ride against a horse's brain rather than with it. Very quickly, receptor cells in the horse's mouth or sides tire. They can't continue to send pressure signals to the horse's brain. That's why constant aids become meaningless. It's not that the horse is refusing to respond. It's that he has to override his own brain cells to do so. To ride with a horse's brain, apply aids intermittently. Teach the horse to carry his own body at other times. Self-carriage is easy for a horse to learn because it matches the way his brain works. Self-carriage. Green babies under saddle must learn to balance the weight of a rider, maintain consistent pace, hold straight lines, bend inward on curbs, and attend to a rider's aids. Trainers spend a lot of time in the first few months helping horses with these basics. But once taught, a horse can manage them on his own. Riders don't need to place every foot, round the horse's back every minute, or balance the horse around every corner. There won't be enough attentional capacity for all that when the horse and human team begins complex maneuvers. The basics of teaching the horse to carry his body can be summarized in the phrase, correct and release. Suppose you're teaching a horse to trot at a consistent pace. You pick up the trot, but even with accurate rhythm, weight distribution, and upper body position on your part, it's too slow. You correct the horse by applying leg pressure. If he speeds up, praise him. If he doesn't, try again. But either way, release the pressure after you've made the correction. Horses are not cars. They don't require constant weight on the accelerator to continue moving forward at the same pace. They are thinking, feeling animals who can learn to maintain any pace you teach. A couple of caveats might help here. A correction is not a punishment or a lingering coercion. It's simply a piece of information that tells or reminds the horse what you want. And a release is not a drop. We release a correction back to the neutral point, not back to zero. So, for example, we adopt a neutral amount of leg pressure for each horse, depending on his needs, and hold it steady. Increasing that pressure momentarily is a correction. Returning the increased pressure to neutral is a release. Altering it to zero would be the equivalent of hopping off the horse for a quick burger. Often, correct and release becomes a series of small touches at this early stage. When the horse trots too fast, we sometimes use correct and release in our hands, reminding him to slow down, but always releasing. We don't hang on the reins in an effort to slow the horse, because neural fatigue will make his brain unable to sense that pressure. He'll only learn to pull. By releasing, the horse learns to trot at a set pace until you ask him to change it. He learns that he is responsible for doing that. The horse's job is to respond to new stimulation, not to make you do all the work. A very common mistake occurs when riders cluck incessantly to a horse in an effort to increase speed. The sound interferes with every other horse and human team within earshot, teaching all of them to ignore clucks. Every month or so, to encourage a horse to leave the ground on a sketchy jump approach, or to increase the pivot angle of a reining spin, you might need to cluck. Once. And you want it to mean something. Clucking till the chickens come home ruins the effect entirely. Spurs or crops are also misused far and wide because of a failure to understand sensory adaptation. Sometimes an uncooperative horse needs spurs, but letting them rest against his sides at all times is a huge error. Just as the receptor cells in the skin of your wrist adapt to your watch, the horse adapts to your spurs and soon loses sensation of them entirely. Riders end up pressing harder and harder or using stronger spurs, all to no avail. Instead, the horse needs to feel the spur or crop rarely but firmly, as a reminder that is immediately released. The purpose of a spur, crop, or cluck is not to make the horse go faster. It's to teach him to respect your leg. Categorical perception. The barn hose adorns the same place every day. When it's moved a few inches, no one notices except the horses. Some of them only cock an ear toward the change. Others go goggle-eyed and giraffe-necked as they scoot past with their bellies arched sideways like bows. Annoying, isn't it? They walk past that hose every day. But there's very good reason that horses notice tiny differences that we miss, and it's called categorical perception. Human brains operate on the basis of categorical perception, the natural tendency to organize sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and touches into meaningful groups. We hear the same words spoken by 100 different people, male or female, hoarse or smooth, high or low, children or adult, foreign or local. Every version sends a different acoustic form to the ears, but the brain's categorical perception tells us they're all the same word. We taste cheddar, jack, brie, Limburger, chèvre, and mozzarella, but bind all of them into the category of cheese. We see doors from different angles all the time, yet we group all of them together as doors. In fact, we are so accustomed to the brain's automatic grouping of different instances that we rarely notice it. The downside of human categorical perception is stereotyping. Our brains are designed to sort rapidly according to external traits. They automatically assume that every Latina is dark-haired, dark-eyed, and olive-skinned, that people who say, "hey," are from the southern United States, or that all saddlebreds are nervous. We have to work to avoid these biases because our brains are so good at producing them. The upside of categorical perception is speed. We group separate items instantly without thinking. Most of us are not aware that our brains categorize items automatically, and we cannot imagine what our lives might be like if our brains didn't do that. With effort, we can stave off the brain's tendency toward categorical perception temporarily. It's hard to do, though. Conjure up the image of a horse you know. Think for a moment of the view your eyes receive. Viewed head-on, Cutie looks nothing like the view you get from her back or side. She's light gray, but when caked in dried mud after a good roll, she looks like a buckskin. If she suddenly lifts a hind leg and scratches her ear, we're not fooled by our eye's view into thinking she's a dog. Categorical perception is so powerful that it's hard for us Homo sapiens to even imagine that each view of the same horse could represent an entirely new animal. Equine brains don't have much categorical perception, and that's why horses notice minor discrepancies among items within what we would call the same group. To a horse, a different view of a familiar object is the equivalent of a new object. When we see a barn hose, our neural networks are firing simply for hose. We take a glance, and yep, it's a hose. There's no need for human brains to specify further. But our horse's neural networks are firing new hose, faded hose, muddy hose, green hose, black hose, hose wound in 24-inch loops, hose wound in 14-inch loops, stretched out hose stored by sloppy human, or hose stored by OCD human. Because they look different, to a horse, they are different. Every perception is separated in the equine brain, so that the same non-categorical effect occurs with sounds, touches, smells, and tastes. We say the horse has seen that hose a million times, but in fact, he hasn't. He's seen a slightly different view of a hose many different times. We are the ones whose brains assumed those different views all represent the same hose. Their lack of categorical perception is one of the reasons horses don't need to have a precise visual acuity or excellent sound localization. Their brains notice tiny differences instead, and that ability allows them to survive. A horse who is exposed to the same jumbled scene every day will get used to it. But because of categorical perception, our brains assume that the jumble remains constant, when in fact it changes. At one ranch, I used a round pen located next to a storage area for large equipment. Horses who'd used that round pen for years still skirted the jumble because the equipment was moved slightly, or added to and deleted from almost every day. I had to study the scene at length to identify those changes, or use logic to infer that someone had used the hay rake yesterday and probably parked it differently afterwards. Horses take one glance and see such variations instantly. Training and trust help horses learn to ignore their lack of categorical perception, just as humans learn to override stereotypes. But we should remember that equine and human brains are working against their respective natures under these conditions. When humans are tired, distressed, or pumped up with adrenaline, our brains revert to stereotyping behavior. And when horses are pressed into uncomfortable situations or lose patience with handlers who don't understand them, their brains will direct them to whirl and bolt from familiar objects. That's just the nature of each beast. Put these 3 brain-level processes of perception, sensory compensation, neural fatigue, and categorical perception, to work for you and your horse. Try to experience the world through his brain. Notice how different it is from yours, and caution yourself from assuming your horse perceives the world like you do. Stepping inside a prey animal's brain, even for a brief moment, is a special honor. To get the audiobook version of Horse Brain Human Brain or the print version, go to stallandstable.com/books. This was a long episode, listeners, and I hope you found it interesting. As usual, go to stallandstable.com to find out more about what we talked about today, to get links and information about Triple Crown Nutrition or Horse Brain Human Brain. Thank you so much for following along. That's going to be a wrap for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it.